All right. We are live.
Cool.
And welcome to the
I don't know
analysis.
how long I'll be here, but
Okay.
'cause I'm kind of at work, but we'll see.
All right.
Right.
Cool. I'm going to do a little aid for us here. So if people don't remember what the different chapters are, I've got the different portions here in the mind map.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, should we like introduce ourselves briefly or something?
Go ahead.
I don't know.
Go ahead.
Yeah, okay, I'll start. Yeah, I'm Miguel. I'm in Boston, Massachusetts, and I'm a PhD student in literature.
All right. I'm Watson. I live in Austin, Texas, and I just study Zizek and Lacan for fun.
Yeah, same here. I study Lacan and Zizek for fun. I've recently got on a Rene Girard phase. I don't know if you guys heard of him.
Excellent.
I find him really interesting. But I'm from Arkansas, big, sadly Trump state. But
Yeah, my name is Ethan. I'm also like Watson. I'm in Austin, Texas, and I also am just an enthusiast, just a hobbyist. Like the work of Zizek, and Zizek has also been for me like a major kind of just a jumping off point. So I get introduced to a lot of other texts kind of through him because he is pretty an avid reader, as you know. So, anyways.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So I guess we all have gone through the text. I don't know how you guys want to proceed. We can go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to, I guess, draw attention. So what I found really fascinating, particularly about the first section, is thinking about the analysis of form as being the primary interpretive site. So, you know, that Zizek is claiming what the resonance between Lacan and Marx is, or between Freud and Marx in any case, is that the idea of it's not, you don't have to interpret the dream as such, right? Like you don't need to learn about, I guess what the word that he uses is the latent dream thought, because they can have a relation to conscious thought that, you know, that is quite easy to determine, but it's in fact, why does the dream organize itself in such a way? Why does the thought move from conscious thought to a dream? And in the same way, Marx is asking the same question about the abstraction of the commodity. That why is it's not what the commodity is, it's why is the commodity abstracted in such a way. I mean, does that seem right to you guys?
That does seem right. The only thing that's a little catchy there is that form, and just that word form oftentimes is a little bit tricky, but yeah, it's like the process of how it goes, not the latent dream content, not the manifest dream text, which is like Freudian verbiage, but how that stuff gets drawn into the dream is the...
Right.
Yeah, as I was reading this section, Watson, if I'm picking up on what you were sort of hinting at there, as I was reading this, especially the first section, I wrote down some questions around, like, is he, some of the terminology that he's using, it wasn't immediately clear to me that he was using it consistently. and it made it so that at the end of it, I felt like I came away with like an understanding of like, okay, I think I get what he's trying to say, and Miguel, I think he basically used it successfully, but in the midst of him trying to make his basic point, I was wondering if he was really using all that terminology consistently, and I wonder maybe it would be interesting to go back and really try to dissect where there might be inconsistencies, and that could be a starting point for maybe trying to counter whatever his thesis is here. But I don't know. Anyway.
Which words do you think were inconsistent?
Well, specifically the Freudian phrase latent content.
Yeah, That's definitely a specific thing, and so is the manifest dream text. Like the Freud, the interpretation of dreams, the book. He totally. Those are totally two separate things.
Yeah, and I get that. It's just that the way that Zizek was invoking them seemed to be was just kind of it's just kind of all over the place. It just seems kind of like it just seems chaotic, but maybe that's just can be attributed to.
Let's read a piece of that. So I'm looking here on in my copy on page 4. Let's see here. So he makes a difference between the primary and the secondary process, and he's talking about, and that's a Freudian thing.
Right.
So let's see if we can uncover something there. So under certain conditions, this thought is pushed away, forced out of the consciousness, drawn into the unconscious. That is, submitted to the laws of the primary process, translated into the language of the unconscious. The relationship between latent thought and what is called the manifest content of a dream, the text of a dream. The dream in its literal phenomenality is therefore that between some entirely normal pre-conscious thought and its translation into the rebus of the dream. So I think that's the closest where you use both of those terms. You see some things there that are kind of, you see like there's a difference when he's saying manifest content and he's talking about the text of the dream.
Right.
And then the latent content. I think latent content, and correct me if I'm wrong, Miel, but latent content could be a whole, I think latent content could even be coldness that you feel while you're laying in the bed. And then in the dream, the manifest text comes in where you have coldness in the dream or something like that. It's all of the things that are underlying, but the manifest text is actually what you're seeing.
Right.
And the process of that going between, that's the bizarro world stuff.
Right. Well, it's the very next sentence is kind of like the really is where it all kind of
okay.
The essential constitution of dream is thus not its latent thought, but this work, which confirms the form of a dream.
Right. So yeah, and then what he's referring to there is the idea of the dream work, which is also from interpretation of dreams. And so like I think what he's laying out here is that a common colloquial analysis of a dream would be like, oh, your teeth are falling out in a dream. That means you're afraid of losing control.
Right.
Done. We figured it out. Right. We figured out the dream. But what's happening there? So the manifest text of the dream is the teeth falling out, and one aspect of the latent content is that anxiety about losing control of your life or whatever the case may be. But it is not the case that anxiety is unconscious anxiety. That is, in fact, an anxiety in your consciousness. You experience it in your day-to-day life. Thus, it makes the latent content. And so people in colloquial dream interpretation, they say, oh, it's the unconscious fear of losing control of your life. But that's not where the unconscious comes in. The unconscious comes in, and I wrote this down in the note, like right after this passage. The unconscious is what turns the latent content into the manifest content.
Right.
And it is such that, so this mechanism is kind of is obscure, right? It's the mechanism that Freud has a lot of interest in, that Lacan has interest in, and that Marx has interest in not in the language of dreams, but in the language of the commodity. What causes the abstraction to commodity?
So that all makes good sense. So one question I had though is that then the term desire gets brought in here, and I wasn't sure where. So where does desire fit?
So for Lacan, I can definitely say that desire is always unconscious desire. So you have you can draw a distinction between desire, which has a relationship with unconscious, which has a relationship with the drive, and
Sorry.
Sure.
So is the claim here that desire is purely formal?
Desire arises from a sense of lack.
Yes. Yeah. And it's separate from will. It's separate from what you want. I think I mean Lacan says people, this is paraphrasing, but people don't know their own desire. That it's that fundamental sense of lack that is constitutive of the subject and produces the desire that you don't recognize, and it plays out through various kinds of pathologies, I guess, is one thing about desire. But I'm not sure that I mean, because okay, on page 5, the first full paragraph towards the middle with the italics. Well, here, this is what I highlighted. This normal conscious preconscious thought is not drawn toward the unconscious, repressed simply because of its disagreeable character for the conscious, but because it achieves a kind of short circuit between it and another desire, which is already repressed, located in the unconscious, a desire which has nothing whatsoever to do with the latent dream thought. So I think what's happening there is an explanation of this question of the dream work and what's the role of the unconscious in the dream. That the unconscious is not the latent dream content turning into it, that then becomes the manifest text. The latent dream content doesn't have a relationship to the unconscious, but what it does is you have the short circuit that connects to a repressed desire, and that is in the unconscious. So it's almost as if, I don't know if this is a very good metaphor, but if the latent dream content is a net, and that movement of the net is how it gets shifted into the manifest content of a dream, that net catches desire, catches something in the unconscious, and that's the role of the unconscious. And in fact, perhaps this is a bad metaphor because it's the unconscious that is that calls for the movement of the net in the first place. Like the dream wouldn't even be happening if there wasn't the relationship between the latent dream content and desire. That they have a certain relation, and that relation is the one of thinking about in terms of the symptom.
I've got some notes here from a guy named Sean Homer about the unconscious. It says the unconscious is a process of signification that is beyond our control. It is the language that speaks through us rather than the language we speak. Lacan defines the unconscious as the discourse of the other. The big other is language, the symbolic order. This other can never be fully assimilated to the subject. It is a radical otherness which nevertheless forms the core of our unconscious.
Yeah.
So I think I'm kind of making a connection here, because I guess what I'm looking for is and Miguel, you honed in on exactly one of the sentences, that section that you read a moment ago is one of the areas I was interested in. So I think I'm starting to understand the connection between. Where did that go? So where was that statement about work? Okay, so there's that sentence on page 5 says, I guess they're both on page 5. So there's the sentence, the essential constitution of dream is thus not its latent thought, but its work, which confers on it the form of a dream. That sentence, and connecting that sentence with this, because it achieves a kind of short circuit between it and another desire which is already repressed, located in the unconscious. So it's not that desire itself is purely formal, but that the formal structure, desire gets caught in the formal structure. Is that right? Am I just going off? I'm trying to understand the connection between desire and that idea of like the work and the formal structure of the dream. Do you see kind of?
No, I think that's a. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that again. The word form. There's so many ways to approach it. One thing is the concept, like what Seth was saying earlier. When you're thinking about form, you have to think. You can think about lack, or you're going to have. I mean, one example is you think of the the sky, and you see the sun, and then you have that's the you could say that's the signifier, and when the sun's missing, you see that over and over again, and then you say, okay, this is nighttime, right? And so you have the place of inscription, which is the sky, and then you have the sun with the signifier. That kind of missing, that place of inscription and how things are there and then removed and all that, that's where we start talking about structure and form and all that stuff. So lack is something like a missing space. And when we're talking about desire, again, now you kind of have that concept of form. There's a missingness. So the unconscious, like what I had was the same thing with what Miel was saying, unconscious sexual desire. When it's repressed, it has no place in the syntax of everyday language, right? And so you have a whole bunch of things in there where we're still trying to talk about this form, something repressed or something that's there and removed from the everyday language. So removed from there. So now you have form as far as with respect to that. And then you have form with respect to within the unconscious, like trying to say, okay, what is the original lack? And you can go in and maybe Miel can talk about it more, but talking about your fundamental fantasy and all these things, like when you first start having desires and all of your sexual position and your strategy and all of that stuff, that's your unconscious sexual desire. So that's going to have an effect.
Yeah. And I mean, I think another important point from Lacan is that he says the unconscious is structured like a language. Right. And he says, I'm afraid I might misquote this, but he says that the unconscious is an infernal translating machine that turns words into symptoms. And one of the examples that he uses is a patient continually banged her head when waking up in the morning because of a surprising movement toward her bedroom wall. And then he goes on to say the symptom disappeared when the patient linked this symptom with a phrase heard in childhood, that the mother always said of the father that he woke up on the wrong side of the bed. And so it's the idea of a symptom is made up of words. This and it's getting mediated through the unconscious. I mean, it's a very thought-provoking example. I'm not sure how well it elucidates what Zizek is discussing when he's talking about symptom, because he has a sort of more expansive definition of symptom, I think, than thinking about like the symptom in psychoanalytic practice that Lacan's talking about in the example I pointed us to. But I don't know if that was at all helpful.
Yeah, I still have some questions, I guess, about the connection between form and desire. Although all of that has been, both of you guys, y'all's comments have been, they're interesting, especially the idea about. So I guess I understand. So I can see the connection between lack and desire, and I can see a connection between form and lack. So somewhere in there, those things kind of hang together. But maybe we can keep moving.
Okay. Yeah, and just one last remark is, thinking about the relationship between desire and form. I mean, I think the reason you don't know is because that's the question, right? Like that's the question of this text. It's trying to determine that relationship, and the only what's really important about what Zizek is arguing here is not that he's necessarily explicating that relationship, but that he's saying that relationship exists in the psychoanalytic work of Freud and Lacan, and that it's also similar to the economic analysis that Marx does. So yeah, I mean, in thinking about using that as we move on, thinking about, so he says on the bottom of page 7, we find exactly the same articulation in 2 stages with Marx. in his analysis of the secret of the commodity form. And he goes on to say, in other words, this is on page 8, the bullet point. In other words, classical political economy is interested only in contents concealed behind the commodity form, which is why it cannot explain the true secret, not the secret behind the form, but the secret of the form itself. So we have this notion of unconscious desire that at least gives us a clue to thinking about the form of the dream. And that clue is in the interpretation of dreams and in thinking about the dream work. In economics, we don't really have this apparatus here. That there's not much insight beyond what Marx has said to think about what is this secret of the form itself, because classical political economy has always wanted to translate, has always wanted to say, let's figure out the relationship between, to kind of use Freud's terms, the latent content of the economic formation and the manifest text of the economic formation. But that's not, for Zizek and for Marx, Zizek's articulation of Marx, that's not the primary question. The question is actually, where do we find this idea of, what's the corollary for the unconscious and for desire in thinking about economics?
Right.
Right. There's exactly what you were just touching upon. There's I read there's a little bit of the preface, where he's kind of, which I don't know if you guys have read the preface, and I don't know if it's a preface only to the version that I have, because it sounds like it was written ex post facto, but he's basically talking about, he's setting up the text as being about like what he calls Ptolemization. So as referencing Ptolemy, that like as more data was coming in, that the Earth was not the center of the universe, that Ptolemy and his cohorts tried to just basically assimilate that data without fundamentally changing the model, basically kind of resisting revolution, and so I think kind of that kind of to your point that we're trying to achieve a sort of a we're trying to retrieve or achieve a revolution against Ptolemization, and in order to do that, we need to go beyond the latent content, and we need to address the symptom itself.
Mm-hmm.
There's also, he uses the word fascination with the latent content, like with the example of Miel saying this fascination. There's also a fascination with labor. So within Marx saying, don't be fascinated with the labor, right? And those two things, remember, symptom and fantasy are they're kind of like, kind of not opposites, but they're two different things. So symptoms, fantasy kind of acts like a screen over something, and the symptom is like when you it looks embarrassing, but when you dive into it, then you get the real understanding. And so I think that there's something, he's also saying something there, like the reason why this emerges is because of a fascination. Like if you grow up in the capitalistic society, you are fascinated with labor as wealth in a certain way. It's hard to look at the underlying process, and the same thing with the dreams. The latent content in the manifest text, right? Really, the latent content, it is fascinating. It is something that you are, it screams the real happening. So I think that's a big part of why he's saying that this is a novel thing or a groundbreaking thing, with Marx and Freud.
When you talk about fantasy, it's not the object of desire, but it's setting. If that makes sense.
Right.
Yeah.
It's the way in which we, subjects structure or organize their desire.
Yeah.
To support it.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there was so there was a so then he gets into like heavily quoting what's the I had the this person I hadn't read about this guy from the Frankfurt School.
Reithel or Rethel? I don't know how to pronounce it.
Yeah, I have not read him either. So
the book is $90. So.
oh boy. Yeah.
Oh, just to let you know, I found a PDF of it in like 2 seconds. So.
Oh
okay.
man.
So
Yeah.
Yeah, he leans pretty heavily on this book. Not that that's a problem, but yeah, like gets really interesting. Seemed like the kind of the crux of kind of the next step of his argument is on page 10. In the structure of the commodity form, it is possible to find the transcendental subject. That is, the network of transcendental categories which constitute the a priori frame of objective scientific knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
So where he starts to kind of connect that logic of exchange with the logic of scientific knowledge.
Yeah. So this is just going back a little to page 9. You know, he says right before the unconscious to the commodity form heading, it is never once asked the question. He's talking about political economy. This is a quote from Renthal. It is never once asked the question why this content has assumed that particular form. That is to say, why labor is expressed in value, and why the measurement of labor by its duration is expressed in the magnitude of the value of the product. So for both Renthal and Zizek, it seems to me the assertion here is that the relationship between value and labor, and specifically labor in terms of duration, is taken for granted. That everyone they make the assumption, they're asking a question that the answer to by the classical political economists would be, oh, what are you talking about? Of course a commodity's value is determined by how many hours of labor was necessary to produce it. How could it be anything else? But that's not actually a conclusion that has been adjudicated. It's taken for granted in a certain way, and that's the kind of paradox that Zizek gets to towards the conclusion of the 3 sections that we read. That there are paradoxical things about taking that conclusion for granted in the way that classical political economists have.
Yeah, it's like the labor is the manifest text and the value is the latent content.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny just to kind of invoke a kind of a personal anecdote. It's funny. So I'm a software programmer. The company I work for, we do like a lot of custom projects, and we're basically a lot of energy in the company is spent in trying to always trying to estimate things, and always trying to basically we're always like having a problem with this, right? It's always like a challenge to like, okay, well, how do we basically it's always about like, it always comes down to like the value of whatever we're delivering, like whatever project we're delivering is always expressed as like a quantity of hours of work. Mm-hmm. But we're always like, as a company, like we're always like having a really hard time like making that like actually line up, like making that actually work out, and making sure that like that whoever the customer is, that they basically accept that math, that they accept the equation. And we're always like dancing around the fact that like there's always this sense of like maybe there's something else there, like maybe that like direct connection between like the value of the some project deliverable can be expressed in terms of like a number of hours, even to the point to where like recently there's been like, we've had little, brainstorming sessions about like, hey, maybe we need to try to like basically sell our projects like a different way instead of just like overly fixating on just like, oh, here's like a cost estimate based on like a number of hours. It's interesting, like I don't know, I just kind of like spontaneously made that connection.
So Ethan, it's funny, I'm a computer programmer too, and I wrote a paper on basically the ideology of estimation in software projects, and I used exactly these types of things, so Hegelian limits and stuff like that, to say why I think that it's ambiguous, it's an ideology. So I'll send that to you. It's funny that you're interested in that.
Yeah, I'd love to read that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really fascinating. I think it gets to, a greater question. This wasn't recorded, but what we were talking about earlier, just to give a brief recap of thinking about like the kind of the idea of capitalist realism and the difficulty of imagining beyond capitalism. I think one of the issues, especially when you think about certain Marxists or post-capitalists advocating automation and without divesting people of payment. And so thinking about the fact that there is, and I mean this in the colloquial sense, that using ideology colloquially, the ideology of that the only way you can ever make money is for labor, right? Like it always has to be labor. No one should ever get money for nothing. They must labor in exchange for their capital, and that's an organizing principle of capitalism. Kind of one of the underlying assumptions that this sort of exposes, that this logic of labor, and particularly duration of labor, is necessary for capitalism to organize in a certain way.
Yeah, absolutely. I immediately thought of that, Miguel, when you were summarizing a moment ago. Is like that was the other thing. Is kind of like that whole idea of like earning your keep, of validating you're validating your existence like by the work that you do,
Right.
and proving to the other members of your society that you're not like a mooch or something like that, or proving that you deserve to exist or whatever. Just like I earned everything that I
Yes.
So, yeah.
Absolutely. And so like thinking about that and thinking about how that connects to the notion of the transcendental subject and some other, let's see, what are some other words that Zizek uses? Oh, I forgot where I put my note. But this is on
Categories
page.
of pure reason.
Yeah. Oh, there you go. Categories of pure reason. Exactly. So this
Right.
is right in the middle of page 11, the second full paragraph. In this way, the transcendental subject, the support of the net of a priori categories, is confronted with the disquieting fact that it depends in its very formal genesis on some inner-worldly pathological process, a scandal, a nonsensical impossibility from the transcendental point of view, insofar as the formal transcendental a priori is by definition independent of all positive contents, a scandal corresponding perfectly to the scandalous character of the Freudian unconscious, which is also unbearable from the transcendental philosophical perspective.
So
Yeah.
in that sentence, do we want to say that all positive contents, we're talking about empirical data?
Right.
Type? Okay, so I wish he would have used that word there. Because that makes it clear. But if with it out there, then I'm like, okay, a priori, where's the antagonism? Okay, if it's empirical, and then we're saying, okay, psychoanalytic, fundamental fantasy, all the stuff like that, and we're coming to the point to where we're having subjects and thinking beings. Oh, you have to have an empirical positive content in order to get to that point. Then, yeah. This does look like a bizarre problem. So.
And it's such that a transcendental philosophical perspective, as Zizek terms it, suggests in a certain way, at least in my view, that it is the mechanism by which you can you can have this empirical context. It's unmediated, right? Like what you find using this perspective is what there is. But that's, I think, that precisely what Zizek is problematizing, that viewpoint of that there is something mediating that exchange, and it's or I shouldn't say exchange, that the way that empirical data is organized. There's something mediating that, and it's this pathological process, this scandal, and it's the thing that produces the paradox that he gets to at the end.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting the way he he did start. Well, so I guess when he's referring to sometimes he's so one thing that I get a little bit turned around by is like sometimes he slips so seamlessly in and out of kind of maybe being sarcastic or not being sarcastic, but basically kind of like trying to like dialectically read or represent the position that he actually wants to argue against.
Yeah.
And so sometimes that he crosses that boundary like so fluidly that and then he'll continue that way for like, you know, the better part of a page. And so sometimes I get lost in like, okay, is he trying to basically, you know, represent the argument that he then wants to argue against, or is this his actual argument? I get a little bit lost in it.
He talks about, and I forget, I don't think it's in the Plague of Fantasies. I forget the other book. I forget what forward it is, but he talks about how he describes and uses examples, and it is very much like how you're saying, this dialectical, but he explains it a little bit more. I mean, his position is that, you know, humans learn by negation. Right. So you've got an ostentification. So like pointing and saying that, or pointing in a bunch of places and saying not any of that. And then you can come to the idea of what he's saying. And that, like, for the one example, I mean, what Zizek is supposed to be really known for is describing the real, which is something that can't be symbolized. So he's going to continuously do that, and he doesn't ever stop. But I think it's on purpose. I don't know if you can explain some of the things that he does and not do what he does.
Right. Yeah. Well, so what is, I guess what, and I absolutely agree with you. I guess I wonder, just to maybe try to linger on things a little more. So coming back to that quote, Miguel, that you read from page 11, the transcendental philosophical perspective. What is that?
That's a great question. And so I mean, see, and I am really getting frustrated because I had a note about this somewhere, but I'm thinking like, you know, that this has a kind of resonance. And I mean, you know, anyone correct me if you guys think I'm getting this wrong, but the transcendental philosophical perspective is being the perspective of you know, disciplinary philosophy that says, okay, we're figuring out truth. Here's truth. You know, it has certain through lines with the logic of empiricism and through lines with kind of the Enlightenment thinking. And of course, most famously, and what Zizek kind of rails against, or at least attempts to in a lot of texts, the kind of modernist perspective that endorses ideas of kind of essential oneness, of authenticity, and that he's basically calling into question all of these sorts of assumptions about representing some kind of authentic truth through these procedures, these, you know, philosophical truth procedures that have at their core assumptions that undo them.
Right. So he's simultaneously sort of addressing actual other philosophers of this ilk, but also like the society that basically more or less like inherits that point of view. Is that?
Yeah, I think so. And I think, okay, so I finally found my note that I've been complaining about all this time. On page 14, this is it, at the bottom of the first full paragraph. The confrontation with this place, and this place he's talking about like the other scene, and in relation to, you know, the pathological problem with philosophy. But anyway, the confrontation with this place is unbearable because philosophy as such is defined by its blindness to this place.
Mhm.
It cannot take it into consideration without dissolving itself, without losing its consistency. So the issue that philosophy as a discipline has is that it has to make a very wide-ranging claim, essentially that we have set up these structures here that we can use to figure everything out. We can adjudicate all of these big questions about ontology, about epistemology, about ethics, about aesthetics. That these philosophical apparatuses, they are here to adjudicate these questions precisely. And like Paul Deman makes a criticism of that philosophy disavows its literariness, right? Like philosophy is a discursive frame, and it has an aesthetic component to it, but philosophy, you know, in particularly analytic philosophy, would never want to be thought of as an aesthetic object, right? Like people who write, particularly in our contemporary moment in 2016, in the analytic tradition, they would never want someone to say, "Oh, well, you're a bad writer. Like your prose is not very good." They would say that has nothing to do with philosophy. Why are you even talking about it? But I think that's so. Deman's claim is that no, the literariness of philosophy is quite relevant, and in the same way, Zizek is not talking about literariness. He's talking about the kind of the kernel of nonsense, or I shouldn't say kernel, but the nonsense that philosophy can't identify, that's in itself the kind of like disorder, what he calls the unconscious, this disordered place. That is what makes philosophy what it is. You don't have philosophy, you don't have all of these truth proceedings without the metaphorized unconscious that Zizek is talking about here.
Yeah. There's a great there's a great line actually right before the quote, Miguel, that you read, which was there in the external effectivity of the exchange process is your proper place. There is the theater in which your truth was performed before you took cognizance of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder then also and I guess science is also included in that indictment of philosophy.
Yes, I think that's
yeah, for sure.
I think that's
Yeah.
yeah. And I mean
Yeah.
that gets played out a lot in Nietzsche, and as one of the foremost literary philosophers, if there ever was one who had attention to that, it would be Nietzsche. But anyway.
And then so we get to this there's another quote that I wrote down that I thought was great. Actually but just backing up a little bit. Well, there were two really good ones. There's the and these seem to be like really, really like critical crystallizations of the argument here. Page 13, the big paragraph at the bottom. The form of thought. So here we have one of the possible definitions of the unconscious. The form of thought whose ontological status is not that of thought. That's like a rare moment of like straightforward clarity. It's like we do all this work, all this dialectical work just to like, that's the payoff there almost, it seems. Or there's another one also a little further down. The symbolic order is precisely such a formal order which supplements and or disrupts the dual relationship of external factual reality and internal subjective experience.
Mm-hmm.
I just liked both of those, just kind of really rang out for me, and so I wrote them down and I wanted to read them out loud.
He likes to, it's funny, his newer books that are kind of, I would think an easier read, like the How to Read Lacan. He talks a lot about this subject where it's kind of the unconscious or the symbolic order and these things, like what he says here. It's it's like another scene where the thought's already given. That's another way to describe
Right.
the unconscious. And it's like it's talking through you.
Right.
Right. And so it's kind of, so when again, going to the word thought, like what do we mean when we're saying thought? Like something directed at another thing. Is that what we're saying? And then, okay, in that sense, yeah, this unconscious, it's not you in some sense. It's not your conscious mind. So it's like it's inhabiting you and it's doing something, it's speaking through you and all that. So it makes perfect sense. But I'm kind of when I read Zizek and all these other guys, I'm really, really trying to figure out when he says that there's a paradox, when he says there's something that's a contradiction or something like that, I actually really want to find out if it actually really is a contradiction, or is it just simply a paradox? So I'm very, very, I pay a lot of attention to those types of things. He says it's a thought, but it's not really a thought. Well, it's really a thought in one sense and not in another sense, is what I think. So I haven't, just as a side, I haven't found anything within Zizek where it's actually really a contradiction.
Well, but so I think that's great. That's really, really, really well put. And I think if I understand this first section here, I think the point is the distinction that he's trying to make comes back to that quote on that line on page 13. The form of thought whose ontological status is not that of thought.
Yes.
So and I guess so that's the $1 million question, or is like, how do you have the form of thought without actually being thought?
Well, I mean, the form of a thing do you think that that's necessarily all of the thing? We just spent a whole bunch of time talking about content and all this stuff. And there's kind of, it's hard to you're going to have to get to the point to where you're going to have a position on what a property is and what essential properties are and all that. So you're going to have to get into nominalism, universalism, and all that stuff like that. He's doing his best to not make you have to learn all that stuff when he's talking, I think. But that's a big subject. And when philosophers are writing, they don't have time to tell you about it. They're just like, go read Plato or something like that. So form programmer. So I don't know if you know Lisp, but within the history of Lisp, they borrow the word form, like really and they try to use it like as if it's in the way that we're using it here. A form is like what you would say what a function is. You something that you can pass arguments to or whatever. But the way that this thing that you can pass arguments to, that's a form, right? That's the S expression or whatever. So, and because of the way that Lisp was developed, right, where you basically have, everything's a form, you have a whole lot of power there or what have you. But a form isn't all of Lisp or something like that, right?
Yeah,
it's something that transcends programming languages. It's form is form. Like it doesn't have any. It really doesn't have anything to do with it.
I wonder if maybe the better analogy to programming, and Miguel, sorry, I don't.
No, this is actually very interesting. Keep on.
Maybe the better analogy to programming would not be function, but would be interface. Watson, I don't know if you like. So I recently have started working with the language Go.
Yeah.
And Go has, what you would call like a first-class concept of interfaces, and I've actually now seen the concept of interfaces that I brought in, and even in like something like PHP.
Yeah.
But an interface being not even like a class, but so like in Go, an interface is so an interface is going to be a collection of methods, or it's going to be a collection of, well, they would be methods and not just functions, because they're gonna you know,
Right.
there are no objects in Go. It's not object oriented, but
Right.
But the collection of methods and their signatures. So so the inputs they accept and the values they return. And as long as you so then what you can do, what's interesting with those is that you can then define other functions that define their inputs that they accept in the terms of an interface. So you can say, I have an interface. It's called, you know, I'm not going to come up with a good example off the top of my head. But like you know, I have an interface. Basically, I want to say I have an interface that like has, you know, method A and method B, and then I have some function C that let's say I just call that interface foo.
Right.
Then I'm going to have function C that accepts as an argument an interface of foo. And so then any other structure that you define, any other struct you define that implements the methods of foo can be passed as an argument to C.
Right. Yes.
So the idea of interface, anyways, it's a very powerful abstraction. It lets you do a lot, but it's this purely formal thing that has no instantiation.
Right. It has no instantiation. So I mean, a form is an even more generalized version of an interface. So
yeah. So okay. So just to pose some questions that I think, you know, if anyone ever listens to this, people who aren't computer programmers, but I find both of your articulations quite interesting. So just to clarify, Watson, you made an earlier analogy between form and a function in the context of computer programming. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. And then Ethan, now then you make a kind of a pivot of the analogy between form and the interface that you talked about, right?
Yes.
So that's just like, you know, if people are listening who aren't computer programmers, you can look up those terms, and I will be doing that. I have it written down and adjudicating my thoughts about you know, those analogies. But I guess so what I wanted to ask, you know, bring this back to thinking about Lacan and about this text. Well, although this is still kind of a digression, especially, you know, Watson, you seem to have thought with the idea of form quite a lot, probably more than anyone in this discussion. And so I'm wondering if maybe you can talk a little bit about the idea of form in relation to the kind of Lacanian idea of structure that Lacan says, you know, that the unconscious is structured like a language. So is this a formal comparison? And the reason I asked this question is going on to thinking about more contemporary Lacanians. So Jean Kopjek, who wrote She's at Brown, she wrote Read My Desire, Lacanian Against the Historicist. You know, one of the really important points that she makes is that for Lacan, structures are real. So, but she doesn't talk, at least in what I've read so far, about form as such. So if there's maybe a way that you can link the idea of form, particularly with the Lacanian idea of structure.
That's a interesting thing. So I don't know, as far as like when you say Lacanian idea of structure, that's like a big thing.
Yes.
So so, and then also you got to know that my Lacan is all tainted with Zizek. So I'm right. That's a good question. Form is the way that Ethan was describing interface. That's kind of basically a better example of what a form is. It's just that within Lisp, like you can do what you're talking about there, like make it to where this is how you talk to me, kind of thing. And then other people can use that, or I say other people, but there can be other uses of this way that you talk to me. The thing, and I'm going to go with Zizek when he talks about language and form. One thing that stuck out for me when he's talking about Lacan, when he says, like, when the speech act occurs, this is what a speech act looks like. And then, you know, there's these things with the four discourses and all that, but how a speech act, how it's, and then why people would classify Lacan as a structuralist, like what Zizek does at least, and not so much a post-structuralist, that there are like fundamental things within language that are like fundamental truths or whatever. Zizek says that whenever you do the speech act, and I guess Lacan, it is reflexive always. It always says, I'm speaking. Like that it has two pieces of content. You could say that it has nothing in it. It's like, you know, the speech act goes out towards the other, and there's the one content of what it's trying to communicate, whatever. And that's where you get into the post-structuralists are like, no, you can't. That's all arbitrary, whatever. But the part where he says that is kind of a fundamental like necessity, I think, is it definitely is communicating I am a speech act, right? So every speech act that comes out, that's a fundamental piece of it. And that's what language looks like, is a one piece of it. So we're like, so that's like a hard thing. So that's one. That's one part of a structure of the form of language. And then when you're talking about, you know, the unconscious is structured like a language, that's going to be however the speech act happens. So when the symptom is a speech act, right? It's popping out from the unconscious through the conscious, right? So there it is, you know, that's part of it. And I mean, we could draw up the four discourses of the speech acts and stuff, but I think, like, for those who haven't seen that, Lacan believes that, or I should say mid-level Lacan believes that all speech acts are occur in four different ways: the master, university, hysterical, and analytical. And I don't know how hardcore he is on saying that those are definite, because I've seen people try to say later on he kind of had a different position with symbolic, imaginary, and real, and polarity and some other things. But again, those are forms. That's a form of what a speech act looks like. So speech act, language, all there. Hopefully I answer some of what you're saying. Right.
No. I think that's a very good articulation. Although I will just say, for my own reading, I definitely have some questions about Zizek categorizing Lacan as a structuralist, and also, you know, just thinking about Lacan in terms of, like, in a certain way, all of this material intends toward, and keeping this always in mind with Lacan, intends toward a practice, a psychoanalytic practice, and what you do in the room with, you know, as an analyst with the analysand. But so that's, like, always very interesting in thinking about, like, all of these kinds of, there are clues and insights that you can gain from how he's thinking about things by making sure to, at least at first, stage what he's talking about in that, you know, therapeutic room, as opposed to where, although of course it's quite useful to stage it, you know, thinking about society or thinking about the subject. Of course, Lacan spends a lot of time thinking about the subject in a way Freud was totally unconcerned with the subject. But yeah, but that was very helpful, and I think it definitely brings us back toward thinking about this text, and about you know, how he's talking about form in relation to what is producing certain form.
Yeah. Within these first three, he's also, there is a connotation of, with form, there's a connotation of some kind of process, some kind of, this is how this translates into this, the form of the you know, with the dream, you've got the, like we already said, latent content gets to the manifest content and manifest text and the form of the dream, he kind of points at that and says, "This is the dream work," and like the word "work."
Mhm.
It's like, and so, and then the same thing with the when we're talking about exchange and everything like that, and how, and actually that's something that I wanted to pull up because it's one of my favorite parts in these first three pieces. Let me get it.
Yeah.
So I think that the important point for all of these, for the first three, I guess, I don't know, essays or what have you, portions of the chapter, is this idea of what the symptom is. There's some kind of thing that's hidden that pops out, and the whole structure needs that to happen.
Yes.
There has to be an underlying thing. That's the bizarre thing about all of this.
Yeah.
There has to be this blindness. He says it like 5 or 10 different ways, right? There has to be this unseen thing that pops out, and that's what a totality is. It's when you've got a set of things and you've got something that's excluded from the set, and the totality can only exist because you have something excluded from the set. So here you've got this symptom. I'm trying to get to exchange. Let's see.
No,
here.
but I think that's absolutely right, and I think what gets to that quite well is at the bottom of page 15 and the top of page 16.
Yeah.
Ideology is not simply a false consciousness, an illusory representation of reality. It is rather this reality itself, which is already to be conceived as ideological. Ideological is a social reality whose very existence implies the non-knowledge of its participants as to its essence. That is the social effectivity, the very reproduction of which implies that the individuals do not know what they are doing.
Yes.
So in that sense, it gets back to what we were talking about in thinking about the fact that philosophy and the truth proceedings that it engages in are structured around the kind of ignorance to, whether you put it as Damon would, the literariness, or as you put it as Zizek would, as the kind of unconscious of philosophy, the fundamental assumptions, the things that you don't ask questions about, that why is this inquiry taking this particular form. And I think, it's much the same as how Lacan thinks of the subject, but this is something that gets reproduced over and over and over again. Just like to crudely sketch out the mirror stage, one of Lacan's key ideas very quickly is that, there is no subject, and then at 6 months, the infant identifies itself in the mirror as a totality and having control over that totality, and thus comes into existence as a subject. And what it means to have that subjectivity is to have the jealousy and the aspirational relationship to the figure in the mirror, the specular image. And the specular image is such that it has complete control, right? The specular image of the infant moves its body deliberately, whereas the infant cannot move its own body deliberately. But coincident with that understanding of the specular image is also the fear of the body in pieces. So in the same way that the infant aspires to this totality and aspires to this kind of mastery, they also begin to fear their body going to pieces, a complete loss of control, a complete lack of control. But of course, the body was never in pieces. It's not as though the body in pieces came to be more put together and then came into being as a subject. That this fear and this aspiration, they are coincident with each other in the production of subjectivity, and that's what the mirror stage is. So in that way, we see again, this fear of the body in pieces is the same kind of thing that appears to be something that makes sense, something that's the reality, the lived experience of the infant, to have that fear. But what gets elided through that process is the fact that fear is really a fear of something that never was true, even if the infant believes that it was true.
Yeah, that's interesting, and we could probably go on that for a while.
Yeah. No. Yeah. I'm sorry, and I only mean to sketch it out, only just to see the kind of resonances between how Zizek is looking at philosophy in relation to how Lacan looks at the subject. I think we can see how, when a structure, when a form comes into existence, it has assumptions about its production that aren't quite right or cannot be verified in a certain way that it has to ignore. It has to ignore the fact that, the infant can't think, well, my body actually was never in pieces. I mean, there was no subject before to even have that thought in the Lacanian view.
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but it has to give something up, right? Once it enters, I mean, it has to be sort of castrated off. Once you get out of the mirror stage and enter into the symbolic, there is something that has to be given up, that what Freud would call that oceanic feeling, what you talk about, a sense of completeness and wholeness. You have to give that up once you sort of enter into the next stage, would be symbolic or whatever.
Yeah, and I mean, I think what Lacan would say is that the subject gets produced in discourse, and they lose their relationship with the real.
Correct.
As soon as so that's but yeah, absolutely, and that's what Lacan would say. What you give up is the relationship to the real, to be inscribed in discourse as a subject.
All right. So I guess we're kind of moving into the social symptoms.
Yes.
And I think one thing that we kind of are missing out on is I'm going to tie two things: the way that different concepts of the fetish, and he uses the word effectivity or the effective, and he points it out over and over again, and it's also related to this thing that we're talking about with form and process. But for my book in page 14, practical solipsism.
Mm-hmm.
So actually, yeah, and so this is so with a fetish, I guess the one way to think of a fetish is, I know X, but nevertheless, right? So that's like the form of the fetish, right? So when you're doing that, so
It's
yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, it's like an object that we know isn't valuable, but we treat it as if it is. Right.
That's one form of it, and me and you have talked about that a bunch last year, right? But this effectivity, he pointed this out more than 10 times in these first 3 chapters. So I think it's important. It's the knowing side for with the let's see here, this misrecognition of what he's calling misrecognition of like the symptoms or whatever, is actually important, and it's the form of the fetish, and we're going to start talking about inverted fetishism and stuff like that. But it's the actual behaving in such a way you can act. Well, I guess this is what I want to say. You can say that you know what you're doing is not true. So the way you behave with money, the way even the way to look at your dreams, whatever. And because you act as if it is true or not true, whatever, right? Nevertheless, that is its own kind of little category, this effectivity thing. And so practical solipsism is like you're acting like as if like the world isn't necessarily out there or what have you, or I'm going to actually just get into this discussion of the exchanges, because I find it to be a great example. So we've got Rethel, and he's talking about real abstractions and all of this discussion. And let's see here. So, all right, there's 2 things. Abstraction of the same use of the let me go straight. So I think that the best example is of how exchanges get misrecognized. So when you, and this is on page 17, so I'm just going to skip you guys if you want to do there's another example earlier, but I'm going to go to that. So in a pre-capital society, let's see here. No, let me go back forward. So freedom, this is an easier one. So ideology, you've got freedom, and you've got these different definitions of freedom. So this is the set, right? Let's see here. Freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of consciousness, freedom of political freedom, commerce, and all that. So you've got freedom, and that's the set of things. Now you need the exception in order to make the set work, right? And the exception is, okay, workers, freedom to sell labor. So this is I think this is the most important part in all of this stuff, is this concept. So that we keep going over it, but I think this example is a good one. Workers have the freedom to sell their labor, right? But they also, in another sense, don't have the freedom to sell their labor. When they sell their labor, they lose their freedom, right? They're now becoming a slave to capital.
Yes.
So in one sense, you have this freedom, you can sell your labor, but now you're going to become a slave to capital. In another sense, you simply, when you step back and look at it, no, you don't have the freedom to sell your labor. Both of those together, his argument, I'm saying, is that you have to have that paradox that I just said, in order to have freedom itself, the other kinds of freedom. That's how we understand what freedom is, and that's what ideology is. I'm saying the ideology of freedom. That, and so and then there's a little a more complex one with exchange itself, which that one hits home for me because I'm with cooperatives and things like that. But what do you guys think?
Well, I love that example, and I love that you pointed us to it, and I agree that it's very important to make a lot of, and a big turn for Zizek's argument, both from a theoretical perspective and the perspective of a kind of I guess political perspective, right? Because just as a brief aside, because we're kind of coming to sort of something looking like a conclusion or a cut, if I'm going to make a little Lacanian joke, but that basically this idea of freedom working in this particular way, this is the logic that also determines, like, he makes a list of different universal notions. Another one would be equality, right? And we've kind of thought about this earlier. What would equality be? Well, in the socialist sense, we have the idea of equality is like, I don't know if anyone has seen the picture where it's like, the tallest person stands, and then the person who's a little bit shorter stands on a box, and the person who's even shorter stands on two boxes. You guys familiar with this image? And that's the image. That's equality, right? Like, this is actually, equality is making things equal for everyone to have the same experience, even if you have to give some kind of additional aid. And that would be the logic of socialism, is to, each one to their need. It's not that people will be equal in receiving X amount of money, but it's that people will be equal in receiving what they need. So, and that's a problem, thinking about adjudicating need and so on and so forth. Those are problems of socialism. But that's merely to say that's the logic of how equality operates in socialism. And then we thought about, in opposition to that, libertarianism that endorses an idea of private property. Well, libertarianism is not opposed to equality, as they would say. They would say, no, we're pro-equality. We want everyone to have the same equality. And I'm being uncharitable to the logic of libertarianism here, but I would say that they're saying, no, you're equal to fail, right? So everyone gets the equal opportunity to accumulate, and also the equal opportunity to not accumulate and, be a failure, be homeless, not have any money, so on and so forth. You're equal. You get the equal opportunity to do that. So that's like, again, like what Zizek is talking about. You need both senses of equal. I think most people would understand equality in the more socialist sense, right? That what equality looks like is everyone being able to, everyone being able to eat, everyone having a roof over their head, everyone being able to get an education. but the libertarian logic would be, no, that's not what equality is. That's an inequality. And what because people, have different amounts of work they can do or whatever. So that equality is actually that at that 0 degree, everyone gets the same chance and make of that chance what they will. So all of that
you can totally break the idea of like the libertarian, and I identify as a libertarian, but when we talk about it in such a way where it's the description that is the common idea, even with people that are the major proponents of it, it's completely going to be like how you said, it's going to be like completely broken. So, you have to, in order to, this is what we're talking about here is just like a totally deeper way of, like, when we're critiquing ideology, libertarianism is an ideology too. Mm-hmm. It's a totality, and it's got the problem that you just pointed out inside of it. So it's like, I think that, and this gets into the when Zizek uses the term notion, you have to, what is a good libertarian going to be? He's got to be someone that actually would try to critique it and have an understanding of what a symptom is and what exploitation is. What is exploitation to a libertarian? You probably 10 times out of 10, you're not going to get an answer that's going to be coherent. So that's when you start saying, okay, now we're actually going to struggle with what the word freedom means. I don't think you can come up without this knowledge that we just said of what this ideology of freedom, I don't think you can come up with just about anything that's like a sophisticated way of being, for, capitalism, libertarianism, liberalism, anything. You got to have this kind of, so I think we're at like an order, we're at a deeper level here.
Sorry, go ahead, Seth.
I was just going to say, I always say, of course we have freedom, we have no choice, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly right. And so the reason for that whole digression there was only to kind of put the argument in context of, contemporary political discourse, and thinking about how, Zizek and Lacan, that to my mind, and that's why, I'm someone who's trying to make their living doing Lacanian, study, that I think it has an important consequence, an important contribution to contemporary discourse. So that's the whole reason I kind of gave that little spiel there, but also just by way of giving another, maybe a little, obviously not as pithy of an example as Zizek is able to give, but give me a couple of years and maybe I'll come back to something a little better formulated. But that's but
here, can I say, here's what I think is going to come down to, is that so in the last sentence of the social symptom section, we get that little snippet kind of in single quotes there, the unreason of reason itself. And so I think that what it's going to come down to is that it's going to come down to I think what Zizek is anticipating, what he's trying to set up, and what his almost maybe his entire project, right, is all about, is basically what he's going to try to argue is that not all unreasons are equal. And he's going to say that because what he's trying to set up is, here's what it comes down to, is that every totality, right, has a self-subverting element, and so that what that means is just the failure of reason itself. And then so it's going to come back to like almost like the Kantian notion of like, basically, you have to treat people as ends in themselves.
Yeah.
so Zizek is gonna, I think what he wants to argue for, and this is why I think in particular Zizek would also argue against libertarianism, right? Is that and why Miguel, like the socialist notion of equality, as you were kind of pointing out a moment ago, the socialist equality, the difference between the socialist equality and the libertarian equality, right? Why that comparison is still kind of missing something is I think Zizek is going to say, or he wants to say, that okay, if reason itself like fails, like that we basically can't advocate for human beings, for the existence even of human beings using reason alone.
Mm-hmm.
And so because if we really try to just stick to using reason alone, then we're going to fail. Because if you use reason alone, then probably actually human beings maybe should not exist. But we want to say reason alone fails, but we also want to arrive at that failure through a specific procedure. And only by engaging that specific procedure, which is specifically this procedure of the dream analysis, we see a particular kind of failure, or a particular form of failure, if I may. And then and it is specifically that form of failure then leads us to a particular kind of unreason, which is art, which is a particular kind of art, a particular kind of imagination, right? So it's not to say, well, okay, well, fuck it, like so if we're post reason, right? Well, why can't I say that some arbitrary if all ideology is self-subverting and kind of closed in on itself and all this, so then it's my white supremacist ideology versus your socialist ideology or whatever. So how do we then now we're at an impasse, and how do we get out of that, right? So I think Zizek wants to say, well, the way that we get out of that impasse is reason fails, but we have to arrive at the failure of reason through this specific procedure, of the symptom and analyzing the symptoms, and so that only by doing that, then that points the way forward to like, okay, well, by arriving at the failure in this specific way, that then suggests how we should comport ourselves in the post-rational space.
Yeah, I think so. Well, I'm getting an echo from someone. So with Lacan, with the four discourses, he's got, there's master signifiers. Like, for instance, America could be a master signifier, and then whenever somebody has the background of growing up in America or whatever, that can taint the word freedom for them, and it bends it. And what happens to go with what you're saying, Ethan, you go through these different phases, and then when you get to the analytical phase, you literally can see these. You traverse the fantasy, and you get confronted. You confront the symptoms and all this stuff like that, and you see these, what you're talking about with the unreason. You see this stuff, and then you create a new master signifier. Like you evolve, and then you get another one, but
you subvert the prevailing master discourse, right?
Right, or master signifier. Yeah.
Wow, yeah, that's a very Ethan. I very interested in your formulation. I found it very provocative, and yeah, Watson, that additional part, very, very fascinating. That was great.
All right. Let's see here. We're kind of ready to wrap it up.
Yeah, yeah. We'll make some remarks by way of conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so just to, I'll read the last paragraph on page 18. As soon as we try to conceive the existing social order as a rational totality, we must include in it a paradoxical element which, without ceasing to be its internal constituent, functions as its symptom, subverts the very universal rational principle of this totality. So that's kind of, Zizek really puts it together there. Like, I thought it was interesting in reading this, going from, the social symptom is such a brief section in comparison to the other two sections that we read, but it, of course, really works well to distill his argument in relation to Marx and Freud as Lacan kind of stages it. And I think in terms of the encounter with the symptom and the sort of supplanting of master signifiers and then reinstantiation of others that you guys have talked about, I think that at least, speaking as a Lacanian, that my reading of Lacan is such that his hope is it's not a utopic hope, nor is it one that's particularly invested in a kind of temporality of we do this and then get to this, but rather that he's kind of articulating something that is hopeful in terms of how one can organize themselves as a subject in the moment, and that organization of the self also gets mirrored in certain kinds of political organizations. So, Lacan has a famous quote that was organized as long as it takes to get something done and then disband to do something else. So, because he's very suspicious of the organizations that get to accumulate power and represent the state as such. So, with all that said, we get Zizek's rendering of Lacan and the staging of this intellectual relationship between Marx and Freud, and what we get is the first step of understanding that any totality, whether it's the subject or ideology or a political organization that represents a given ideology, that it will always have the symptom, the paradoxical element that undoes it, and being aware of that is important in thinking about political discourse and practice. Because when you think about the articulation of people voting against their own interests or something, there's a lot of concern from the Democratic Party, who talks about the Republican Party as being a group of people that votes against their own interests. And what they mean when they say that, of course, is not the monolithic realm of interests, because those could be quite diverse, but that they mean economic interests. That they're talking about people voting against their own economic interests and putting politicians in power who don't have their best economic interests in mind. But that becomes kind of a facile formulation when you think about, as Lacan says, Freud says, and Zizek reproduces, that people don't know what they want. No one does. And this relationship, what Jean Kopchak says is she wants a cultural studies that's literate in desire. And for me, my thought is always, I want a politics literate in desire. And that's what I think this text moves us toward.
Yes, a politics literate in desire. That would be really nice. All right. You guys have anything else?
I do, but maybe, I don't know. That was such a nice line to kind of end on that maybe I'll just I'll let it ride.
He's getting ready for his dissertation, so he's practicing.
that is exactly right. Yeah.
We should do a Lacanian cut here and just end it short.
All right. I'm gonna hit